Hi, and welcome back to Police Stories Podcast. I'm Dave, and this is episode 18. This is a series of sort of short stories about various incidents that I dealt with in my career, and invariably a few side stories and general ramblings along the way. So, today we're going to talk about a number of things, but it's based again around kind of probationers, the trainee cops. By this point I had a couple of years in, 2 or 3 years in, so not a lot of experience, to be honest with you, myself, but it was deemed that I was competent enough to go onto this tutor unit to look after the new guys and girls that came in. They spent 10 weeks with us, and it was generally 5 weeks with one tutor and 5 weeks with another. I think there was about 4 tutors working on the unit at the time. And it was just a question of bringing them on, really, and them dealing with various things. It would kind of, ticked them off the things that they should achieve to make sure that they came out of the tutor unit as a reasonably well-rounded cop, that had done a good few of the sort of bread and butter type jobs, your thefts, your assaults, and they had some interviews and some fairly basic stuff, but they were useful from the sort of get-go as soon as they got onto their response teams. So one of the things we took them to was post-mortems. Again, like myself, only sort of 2 years prior to that, never really dealt with death or had any dealings with death. And it was definitely an issue for them, for the probationers. They were always concerned about how it would be and what was the smells like and how would they cope and would they be sick. And you see this stuff on the news where people put, Vicks smelling salts and all sorts under their nose. I've never seen that in the police ever. I think that's a TV thing. Perhaps it happens somewhere, but I've never seen it. It's just something you kind of get used to generally. Or some people go absolutely out of their way to avoid it, and sort of get other colleagues to do it, and they'll happily volunteer for some other task so that they don't have to sort of deal with death. But you can't get away from it in the police, that's a fact of life. So we were quite lucky. We had a training hospital near where I was working, and I spoke to the people in the mortuary there about, we'd really like to introduce the probationers to death and a PM, and also don't forget the probationers, only a few weeks or months after being, with me, would be dealing with their own, kind of sudden deaths where they would be bringing bodies into the mortuary and would have to know the procedure that we talked about before. So invariably we would arrange a tour, and they would have a tour around the mortuary, and the mortuary staff would talk them through, well, this is how you do that, and you fill this book out, and you can use these tough cuts, which are like scissors, to remove clothing, and you can do this, and just talked it through, really. So it helped put their mind at rest a little bit. But the big issue for them then was the actual post-mortem. Now, because it was a training hospital, there was a slab, I think they call it, sort of set up where the bodies would go for their post-mortem within the sort of mortuary area. But it also had a glass screen. And basically the students, normally medical students, could sit the other side of the screen, and they could, obviously watch the post-mortem, and they, there was comms, although it was kind of airtight, so you didn't get the smells, and there was comms between the mortician who was doing the PM, or whoever was doing the PM, because there was kind of a microphone between the two. Now, the only thing is, without the smells and not being quite so up close, it perhaps wasn't as real life as it could be. Now, the guy who used to do the post-mortems where I worked at the time was really, really keen, very helpful, and, was very flexible as to how he did it. So he was more than happy for people to come onto the slab side and be standing around the table as they cut into the person and did the various things. So you got the kind of full-on effect, which was, I wouldn't say appreciated by probationers, but some were like me and were genuinely interested, definitely a morbid curiosity, and others, it was the worst thing ever. So we gave them the choice. They could go behind the glass screen, although I think there was a little bit of bragging rights. So you'd find the odd person would go behind the screen, but mostly they would go in where the actual PM was taking place. I mean, a post-mortem is about as horrific as it gets. It is a very unbelievable process, really, to start with. I couldn't believe certainly what they were doing, which of course happens, hundreds of thousands of times all over the country and the world every day. But it is an eye opener, to say the least, and certainly generally there's a cut made along the top of the head, and that allows for the face, the skin of the face, to be peeled off across the front of the skull. And that then enables them to obviously check for injuries, and they're trying to ascertain a cause of death, which may be well known, or they're pretty confident they know what that is, but they'll always check anyway. But the first time that you see a face slid back across a skull is quite a shock, and then just as you thought, wow, that's as bad as it can get, out comes the bone saw, which basically looks like a mini sort of angle grinder, and they take a neat sort of cap, if you like, off the top of the skull, which enables them to then remove the brain, which is weighed, and before they then move on to the main sort of chest cavity, which is, as you can imagine, cut open, and then once again meticulously the organs are removed and weighed and checked for disease and injury, etc. And then sort of an all-over body check. But you can imagine, exactly like I was 2 years before, naive kind of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, or maybe even 30-year-olds, had no experience of this. They've seen maybe, the odd horror movie and think that they're fairly well ready for gore, but when you go and see it very up close and personal, happening in front of you with the associated smells, it's quite a leveler, to say the least. So I would go down with them initially, and myself and another tutor perhaps would take it in turns to go in the room while they did it. But we'd always make a big thing of saying, oh, well, there's a nice canteen at the hospital, so once you've done with the PM, come up and we can have a nice greasy fry-up, as part of the kind of banter and the wind-ups, that happens in the police. And some would, go along with it and would be like, sure, yeah, I'll be up, or extra bacon and all the rest of it. And others would kind of weakly smile, and kind of nod like they wanted to be part of it, but you just knew they weren't going to be happy. I think out of probably 20 odd probationers we put through this system, I think we had one faint completely at the table, and we had another 2 or 3 that had to sort of rush out, sort of suddenly needed air. Perhaps didn't go as far as fainting, but and I know it sounds glib and people might think that I'm being disrespectful or whatever, but you can't get away from death. And I'm afraid if you were deadly serious about the whole subject, for a 28-year career, you would be a basket case. So what used to be called, kind of the black humor, the canteen culture, comes in a bit in these things, and you have to kind of laugh and joke these things off to a degree. Personally, I always found it fascinating, and this is what I told the probationers that worried. I was like, don't think of it as a person. Just be interested that, oh, right, that's what a liver looks like. Okay, I didn't realise the kidney was round there. Wow, the heart's bigger than I thought. Do you know what I mean? I said to them, try and think of it as interesting rather than horrific, It didn't always work, but for some it did. But as I say, unfortunately, if you're joining the police, you can't get away from it. You're going to come across it. So probably better to do it in this slightly controlled environment than the first time you come across, a horrific fatal accident that is absolutely raw, or someone may still be alive but could still be in that position, which truly is horrendous. So the other thing we would do as a bit of a treat for the cops, and to at the end of their 10 weeks, so they've been through 2 tutors and now they're basically ready to go, but we always let them, and this was always sort of looked forward to, we always let them set up and run their own sort of drugs operation, and we build up on it throughout the sort of 10 weeks, and it would culminate in a drugs warrant being, we call it executed, but that's a drugs search warrant being carried out, but it's generally called executing. The police have executed a warrant, or sometimes it's called a turn or a spin. We've been out to spin someone's address, or we've done a turn, we've executed a warrant, various different sayings, but they're the sorts of things. So the process would be, initially, the probationer would basically, probably just from driving around, would have a pretty good idea of the sort of drugs areas and some of our main drugs players in the town. They'd figure that out quite quickly through looking at the briefings and people that maybe we'd stopped and searched on the street. So they were building up quite a good picture, and we might be, floating around an area in a marked car, and picking out addresses, and you might give them a heads up, this address is used for dealing, etc. And then once they got familiar with the sort of intelligence system, so they were able to go on the computer and check for themselves on information and intelligence, about a particular person or a particular address, From that, we'd tell them, well, you slowly sort of formulate a target in your mind, whether that's an address or a person, and we'll develop it. So that's what would happen, and they would pick someone or an address, and we would then start doing some surveillance on the address. It would be fairly low level, but we'd work in plain clothes sometimes, and that'd be very exciting, for a new cop. Suddenly they're doing this stuff off the telly. They're doing a stakeout, as far as they're concerned. It wasn't quite as dramatic or exciting as that, but that's what happened. Now, one thing I would mention is that although we were doing this at this point, since then, or quite a while ago now, probably 15 years ago, maybe more, something came in called a RIPA authority, or in Scotland a RIPSA authority, that you need to carry out directed surveillance on an address. So it used to be, like with these probationers, we picked an address or a person, we could just carry out surveillance. We didn't have to tell anyone, we didn't have to do anything, we just did the surveillance, and that was that. Nowadays, and when that RIPA authority came into being, what you would have to do is you have to make a formal application naming your target, naming why you're looking at them, and then it would have to go through to a senior officer or somebody else to sign off on, basically. Now, the only change to that was you could do spontaneous stuff. So, for example, let's say you'd had a burglary or a house break-in, and you were given the suspect description, and perhaps you felt that it was probably so and so from nearby, because we knew a lot of our local burglars, so from the description you go, that's Joe Bloggs, I'm pretty sure it is, let's go and sit up on his house. So we might go around and sit up and wait at that address to see if that person came back. Now that's fine, because that's spontaneous and it was off the cuff, it wasn't pre-planned. But anything more than that, if you're going out with a view to surveillance, looking at somebody, then you had to complete one of these RIPA authorities. Now, it wasn't that difficult, and it was rare to get it turned down, but it was just a way of, making sure that it was correct. And again, obviously, we had to teach the right way. But anyway, back to my point, at that time, we didn't have that. So you could carry out surveillance on anyone you wanted without having to sort of tell anyone. So we would carry out a bit of surveillance on an address, and we'd be looking particularly at how many visits that address is having. Is that address getting visited all day and night, by people, by cars, things being passed out the window. We'd go away and look at the computers and look at the information intelligence systems, because chances are there'd be intel on there saying, Joe Bloggs is dealing from this address. He keeps it, in the drain pipe outside, whatever. Because you'd be amazed within the drug world, a lot of the old school thieves and that had there was honor amongst thieves, and you didn't tell people things. But dealers, and particularly if they felt that there was rival dealers on their patch, would happily ring us up anonymously and say, Joe Bloggs is dealing and this is where he keeps his drugs. There was no qualms about that, which obviously benefited us. So we would build up with some surveillance. It would give them a chance to look at the intel system. And what we might do as well is, if we picked a particular person that had come out of an address that we were pretty confident, had sort of turned up, kind of had the look of a druggie, basically, and that's generally they've been on the heroin diet. They're very, very skinny. You can see the track marks on their arms. They might have blisters on their face. Generally pretty scruffy and down and out type look. If someone like that had gone into a known address and within 2 minutes is out the door and back down the road, we might then follow them off on foot or in a vehicle, but make sure that they're well away from the address. So it was very clear, or we thought it was, that we hadn't been watching that address. And we would just simply carry out a stop search on the street, which we had the power to do because we suspected they were carrying controlled substances, and that's all you need, a reasonable suspicion that they are carrying controlled substances for a street search under sort of Section 23 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. I sound a bit nerdy then, don't I? But so this person would be searched. Now, ideally, we'd find some drugs on them. Not always, but quite often we would. And then they could be arrested and processed. But it would give us a bit of a clue as to what's being dealt from there. Back in those days, was it, a big bag of weed? Was it cannabis? Was it cocaine? Chances are it was heroin, the sort of class A, the strong stuff. And that would definitely be our main target at that time, and still is. So that would be extra evidence for us when it came to actually swearing the warrant out. So, and what would happen is we'd gather all this information, this intelligence, as much as we could. As I say, this would build up, culminating in the sort of last week, for example. we would then have to, or they would then have to go and swear the warrant out. Now, the process of that is in England and Wales, you basically have to seek out a magistrate. And there's an on-call magistrate as well, so you can get one 24 hours a day. Although it better be good if you've got them out of bed at 3 in the morning. Generally, it would be during daytime hours, and you would visit them at their home address, and they would ask you to either take an oath, so that would be holding the Bible up exactly like you were giving evidence in court, or an affirmation if you weren't religious. There was a few words you could say that's effectively saying, I swear to tell the truth. You would then lay the information on the magistrate. It's all these sort of old sayings, but the reality is you are telling this magistrate, him or her, kind of, I would like to apply for a drugs warrant at this address, a search warrant at this address. You'd filled a form out already, so they had a kind of clue what it was all about. But you'd say, there's information that drugs are being dealt from that address. You had to have at least 2 different sources, and also if both of those were anonymous, sometimes that was, kind of looked down on a bit, because, like I say, they know drug dealers and other people who just, don't like the person or whatever would ring up anonymous information falsely about people. So it always helps if you could, if the probationer was kind of well briefed before they went in, that they'd say, there's information they're dealing, and then they'd say, we carried out surveillance on the address, and during one day, over a period of an hour, there was 8 separate visits to that address. We then followed one of those visits off, carried out a stop search, and the person was in possession of heroin. They were arrested and processed. There's also, 2 or 3 bits of intel suggesting their dealing, and whatever you had basically. And after that, the magistrate would decide whether they thought there was enough evidence to issue a drugs warrant. Generally, they did. I'd say like 95% of the times. Occasionally, you'd get the odd cheeky cop turning up on a bit of a fishing trip with some very flimsy evidence. And the magistrates, they weren't stupid. They'd see straight through it and say, no, I'm not authorising that. You need more. So you'd hopefully come away with your nice bit of paper, and normally there'd be a time scale on it. So it might say, must carry out a drugs warrant at this address. This warrant is valid for 30 days or whatever it was. So you'd have a bit of time, and that would be ideal, because then we'd get the probationers, we'd carry out some more surveillance, and we'd teach them some slightly more advanced stuff in relation to thinking about the process of carrying a warrant out. You don't just rock up and, put the door in or knock on the door or whatever. You can do, but generally, you're far better off if you're prepared. So it might be that, they would have a walk by the address. That would definitely happen. And then we would also ask them to brief our little team. It would be other probationers carrying out the warrant with them. So we might put together half a dozen and maybe have 2 or 3 tutors, or something like that. So there might be maybe, 6 of us in total, perhaps 10, something like that for a small warrant. But we get them to brief the team. They go right through from scratch. So they've developed this warrant, they've obtained the search warrant, they've carried out the surveillance, and they've also looked at the address. And what we're looking for in a walk by is what we talked about last week with the MOE, the method of entry stuff. If we need to force a door, what's the door made up of? Which side is it hinged? How many locks does it have? Which we might be able to establish from watching people coming and going. What's the door made of is a really important one. Wooden doors, not too bad. UPVC plastic doors can be very difficult because they have multi-locking points. And that's why, again, last week we talked about, slightly more aggressive techniques, shall we say, for getting into addresses that have those things. But at the time, it was generally low level. The other thing they like to do, proper James Bond from their point of view, was we might have an old sports bag that had a sort of mesh end to it, and we would cut out a hole in the end of the mesh end. And then we would have a video camera that had a lens right up to that hole, but it would have like a piece of black tights or stocking over it, so you really couldn't see it. They would walk along the street with this sports bag, and then when they got outside the address, they would put the bag down on the floor facing the address, and particularly the front door, and then just tie their shoelace or something, pretend their shoelace was undone. And all that did was give us some footage of the front door, obviously, and that way during their briefing they can show that, so all the officers know, what we're looking at, which address we're looking at. And vitally important, I can't tell you how many times cops have gone to the wrong addresses and smashed the wrong door down. It does happen fairly regularly. And so we really need to know. Certainly later in my career, when I was doing firearms, and we were regularly asked, because we were sort of had slightly more specialist skills and equipment for putting in difficult doors, we might be requested by another area to go and help them put their door in. And we would not do it unless a local officer came with us, walked up to the door we were going to do, and basically pointed at it from 6 inches away. So we walk into the door to do this door. He or she walks up to the door and points at the door, and that's the door we smash down. Because, like I say, the last thing you want to do is put the wrong door in. Now, sometimes cops couldn't help it. Sometimes some of these addresses are incredibly difficult to figure out. You get told it's 2 Smith Lane or whatever, and when you get up there, there might, just depending on the layout of the building or the road, it might not be clear. They don't have numbers on. Ideally, you'd have a bit of a steer, like it's a blue door, it's a red door, whatever. That would help. You can guarantee you get there'd be half a dozen red doors, and they'd all say number 2 on them because the other numbers had fallen off. So sometimes I could see how it happened, but sometimes it was just bad planning, quite frankly. Although don't forget, you can't always plan these things in advance. We had that luxury. It might be something you're trying to put together within a matter of an hour, and obviously your sort of planning phase can only do so much within an hour. So that's the front door. And obviously the other thing you need to know is the back door, because obviously the classic is you coming through the front door, Mr. and Mrs. Bad Guy go out, you going through the front door, sorry, and they're straight out the back door. So you need to know about the back door. So you might have to walk down some alleys, and have a look. We might go to an address that's directly behind the one we want to hit, and then tell them we're carrying out some house-to-house inquiries for a burglary that happened in the area. Could we just come in and see if they had a view of the premises that got screwed from their window or something like that, just to enable us to get a look on that back door of the premises we wanted to hit, because we want to know, is there a balcony? Is there a ladder? Is there stairs down? Is there fences? How high are they? Are the fences all broken down? Are they going to fall apart the second someone tries to climb on them? Is there a big drop? Now, that's a classic. Sometimes at the back of these addresses, there could be a fence at the bottom of the garden, which was about, 3 feet high. If you hop over that fence, there's a 12-foot drop, and unfortunately, we've had a number of cops and bad guys injured like that because, obviously, without that knowledge, especially at night, or if you're chasing someone, you hop over a fence and realize there's a massive drop. So, yeah, it's all about the planning, really. But the probationers always found it really exciting. The sort of advanced probationers that were coming to the end of their 10 weeks, they would put the whole package together, start to finish. Then on the day, they would brief us, and they would decide how we did it, because there was different options as well. So, for example, if we had information that we did one where we had information that the front door was really well secured. Now, we were just doing basic method of entry at that point. So we're talking just a big red key and enforcer. We're basically going to hit the door and smash it down. But we had good info that there was kind of 3 steel bars, behind this door, and that no one was getting through it. I think it had a security grill on it as well. So it could have been done, but, it would have been more specialist than we were, that's for sure. And the other thing is, sometimes, of course, people put these massive, effective front doors on. You think, wow, I'm never getting that. And they're bragging, no cops getting through my door. And you go around the back and it's like a thin, wooden door with a single glazed piece of glass in it that you just tap with your baton, and reach in and open the door handle, So quite often people forget that, you can come in multiple ways into an address. So, yeah, they need to figure out. So on that case, this probationer had set his heart on doing this particular address. We had all the information, all the intel. We'd done the surveillance. We got the warrant. Then late on, this information came in that the front door was really, really secure, like massively over secure. So he was really sort of downhearted. He was like, I don't think we can do it. So, well, hang on a sec. Let's have a think about this. Is that the only way in? What other ways in are there? Well, there's a front window. Yeah, okay. We won't rule that out, because coming through a front window is possible. We've got the hoolie bar, which is this big metal spike that you can basically hit the glass with, shatter it, and go in through the window if you have to. Especially if you can justify why you're doing it. The front door's so secure, the window's, much easier option. But I said, let's have a look around. We had a look at the back door, and that was also quite well secured. So I said, well, how are we going to do it? Have a think. So you try and get them to think a bit laterally, and you kind of lead them down a path. You'd be like, do you have any parcels delivered to your address and stuff where you live at home? And of course they're looking at you going, well yeah, of course I do. Postie brings one, or the courier or whatever. Right, fine. And how do you get that parcel? And they're like, what do you mean? How do you get that parcel? So what happens? Talk me through you getting a parcel. And they're looking at you like you're mad, Like, well, postie rings the doorbell. I open the door and I say, thank you very much, and take my parcel. And you're like, right, just slow down. What's the second part? Well, I open my door. Really? So you open your door. So how about if we had a friendly courier, let's say you, for example, meaning the probationer, dressing up, as a courier? Well, obviously, like posties had a uniform, but couriers, obviously could wear anything. So all you needed was a fluorescent jacket, a clipboard, maybe a hat. We generally tried to avoid Royal Mail uniforms and things. We did have them, but we avoided them because we didn't want to drop the posties in it, because obviously the posties would then have to go back to this address and deliver normal mail at some point. So we didn't want the posties to start getting attacked, because they were wrongly believed they were cops, about to do a drugs warrant. So invariably we took the courier route. So of course their little eyes lit up when they said, "Oh wow, what? So I can play like courier?" Exactly. Go up with your clipboard. We'll find you a moody, parcel. You stick it under your arm, tap on the door. "Hi, is Mr. Bloggs in? Got a parcel for him." Sometimes a bit suspicious. "I didn't order anything." "Oh right, okay, I'll take it away again." But people can't help themselves. Like, oh no, hang on, don't be too hasty, Anyway, that's what happened. And of course, we came up with a plain van. And on this particular day, it was a great job. We had like kind of 8 of us in the back of this plain white, small van, and it pulled up outside the address with the courier, which was our probationer, driving it. He parks up outside the address. We're all set in our full kit with, because I was doing the MOE, so I had like the NATO helmet with the visor and the big red key ready to go. And the other tutor, sort of had the hoolie bar should we need to sort of divert and change to smashing a window or something. We had all our kit on, so we looked the part, all the pads and all that. And the rest of the probationers were all in a big gaggle behind us. And the plan was, obviously come to the door and we would charge in. And that's exactly what happened. It was a great job. It went absolutely smooth as you like. So he goes up, he knocks on the door. Sure enough, Mr. Bloggs opens the door. And then, because he's saying, so the probationer's like, well, what do I do? He opens the door. What do I do then? I said, well, we're going to be like 10 seconds behind you. So the second we see that door opening, we'll be with you, But in the end, what we said to him was, as soon as the door opens, just drop your clipboard by mistake, and you bend down and pick it up. That'll give you 5 seconds. And in that 5 seconds, we'll be out the van and up to you. And that's exactly what happened. It was clockwork. It was fantastic. So sure enough, door opens. He drops his clipboard. He bends over. He's like, "Oh, sorry, silly me." And as he bends down slowly to pick this up, there's 10 of us charging up the path. So we didn't need to do MOE, nothing like that. And the other thing was that as soon as he saw the door crack on the van that we were coming out of, he stood up and put his foot in the door. And while the bloke's going, "What are you doing?" The second it's taken him or so to go, "Get your foot out my door, what are you doing?" We're on him basically. We're up the path and coming, and he knows what's coming. So it was fantastic. We got into the address, then we carry out a search warrant, and that's a process as well, obviously. There's a thorough search carried out of the address. You can't imagine all sorts of sneaky places that people hide things, but we do our best. We almost certainly have lined up a drugs dog as well, because they'll go through first to give us an indication where to look. That can save you a lot of time. There's paperwork to be filled out, and then when you seize exhibits or productions, they need to be formally documented. And what we generally do is the person would be detained during the search. They'd be handcuffed. We'd search an armchair, for example, to make sure there's nothing in it, no weapons, no drugs. Then the person who lives at the address, Joe Bloggs, gets sat down in the seat, and a cop stays with him while we then carry out the search around him. And he or she will follow us in handcuffs to the different rooms, just so that there can be no come back later on of, "Oh, you planted that," which of course is the classic. So that's the process. And on this particular day, I think we got about 10 wraps of heroin or something like that. So it was a nice little job. Bearing in mind this is a probationer's first drugs warrant. Up until now, they probably seized a little bit of cannabis and maybe a bit of heroin or something. But for them to have a successful drugs warrant, and seize 10 bags of heroin, and then there's subsequent intel reports to go on afterwards to say, "I executed a warrant at this address. Joe Bloggs was arrested. We found 10 bags of heroin, and we found it, in a pot that was kept in the fridge, marked yogurt or whatever, And that's all useful because, again, I guarantee that a year down the line, somebody else will be looking to do a warrant at his new address. And when they look on the system, they'll see exactly that. So one of the places they might be heading is the fridge to start with. So it's all good stuff. But interestingly, on this day, we finished this job, and I think the probationer who'd actually done it, who was all chuffed, um, was he was sort of one of the ones who was in his 10 weeks who'd arranged it. Now, at the time, I was looking after one of the newer ones who had 3 or 4 weeks. And we were in uniform. There was a mixture of uniform and plain clothes. And a burglary came in around the corner. So I said to this new probationer, a girl, well, we'll take that. You've not done a burglary yet. It's just around the corner. We'll take that on the way back, sort of thing, So that worked out quite well. So we head round to this burglary, and it was the start of a really strange series of burglaries. So burglary is a horrible offence. Hopefully you've never been burgled, but if you have, they call it different things: burgling, housebreaking in Scotland, America, home invasion, that sort of thing. But it's a real invasion of your privacy. Your house is your castle, and it's the place you're meant to feel safe in. But unfortunately, once that's been violated, it's really, really unpleasant. So a difficult one. Anyway, we've been to this burglary, and sometimes you walk into addresses that had been, literally turned upside down. There was stuff everywhere. And a couple of occasions I'd walked in, this place just looked like someone had thrown a hand grenade in the room or in the building, just every room had stuff everywhere and was such a mess, you wouldn't believe it. And I said to the guy, wow, they've really made a mess, haven't they? Literally turned it upside down. And he kind of looked at me and was like, what do you mean? And I said, well, the mess. And he was like, oh no, it always looks like this. You're like, oh, okay, right, awkward. Sorry about that. That could be a bit embarrassing. You had to be careful with that stuff. Anyway, so we go to this warrant, and it was a relatively tidy. Sorry, we go to this burglary, and it was a relatively tidy search. There wasn't an awful lot had been taken, but bizarrely, the burglar had chosen to. There's no nice way of putting this. Basically, have a crap in the corner of the room, like in the lounge. And this was a nice address. Clean and tidy. It was a tidy search, apart from the fact he'd had a crap in the corner of the room, and then he'd used the curtains to wipe his backside, which I'd never seen before. And of course, when we took all the details, obviously there's photos, and we went back and spoke to CID, because at the time, burglaries were automatically dealt with by CID. It's not necessarily the case now, but so it was a bizarre one. But it started off a series of where he actually did about a dozen burglaries, and that was his MO, his modus operandi. That's Latin for basically how he does his crime. And his MO was he always took a dump in the corner of the room and then wiped his backside on the curtains. Now you might be thinking, DNA, could get him. But at the time, DNA was still fairly new, and although it was there and it was useful, from feces, DNA is very difficult. I think it's something to do with sort of dead cells, or the fact that it's a waste product or something. Now you can do it, and now I think they can do it much easier. But at the time, I think they could do it, but they literally was so difficult and expensive that they generally reserved it for things like murders. So they didn't do the DNA on this guy. And also, don't forget that the DNA sort of database was very small. Hardly anyone was on it at that point, because we'd only just started sort of taking DNA permanently, So a very bizarre burglary, and this poor probation who was about 5 weeks in the job kind of looked at me and was like, is this normal? I was like, no, I've never seen or heard of this. And even, grizzled old DCs that we went to see in the DS who had a lot of service were kind of saying, how bizarre, I've never seen or heard of this. But anyway, he did about a dozen burglaries in the area and then eventually got caught. I think it was a series of sort of nighttime patrols, and they just sort of literally caught him red-handed coming out of the dress, almost with a swag bag and a stripy top on, but and he admitted the lot, but there was never really a reason, that he came up with as to why he did this. But very bizarre series. So anyway, I think that'll do us for today. Not really one story in there, a series of ramblings, like I said at the beginning. I think that pretty much covered it. Hope you enjoyed it, and next week we'll talk about have some more stories for you. Thanks very much for the downloads, continuing well on the various places, YouTube and all the sort of podcast platforms. I think we're on there. It's going okay. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Take it easy.